Hello, my name is Matt Fuller, and I'm grateful to be presenting today for Talks Learn for EU. You may remember my previous video where I talked about my PhD thesis in its entirety, but for this particular video, I want to focus in on one chapter in my PhD, which is a chapter on the scientific evaluation. Now, you will, of course, be looking at lots and lots of different scientific papers over the course of your time on this program. So my chapter might just be a refresher, or it might be a good introduction, depending on how early you read it. But overall, I was attempting to do the same thing that many of you are attempting to do, which is to get a handle on the literature by going through scientific article after scientific article and figuring out what I could figure out. This chapter attempted to summarize the scientific research in four different sections: animal testing, population studies, human studies, and gray literature. These studies tended to show, at least in my opinion, that the method of ingestion was the key factor in how much harm was caused by depleted uranium. Inhaling aerosolized particles or having depleted uranium in food or water was much more damaging than having an embedded fragment in, let's say, your arm. So, with that in mind, since my thesis was primarily focused on the political aspects of depleted uranium, I found it interesting that despite a number of studies showing that depleted uranium is harmful to human beings, the campaign against it still struggled to get that message across. And this is for a variety of reasons that I'll be talking about, although I will note that the public tended to focus on the gray literature, which of course hasn't been peer reviewed, and that was a main factor. So, risk communication is one of the ways that I analyzed the campaigners' strategies, and I decided to reapply that social science perspective to the actual science. So, with this in mind, I looked at how the scientists presenting their research communicated risk. Although there are many studies that showed harm caused by depleted uranium, many of these studies have also been accused of bias. And in particular, I point out the study of Shelby Surdick et al. In 2021, where they go through a number of studies done in Iraq and talk about bias in those studies. However, I found that the way that they were discussing bias was really interesting, and that the way that they measured it and different categories and different determinations were not necessarily hard and fast. I found myself disputing their measurement of bias, and I go into some depth on this in the chapter itself. But the point is that even research that looks rock solid still faces accusations of bias. Uh, the ability to track patients and do consistent studies is limited because of the level of violence and chaos in a place like Iraq. Now, this is important to understand because so much of science and evaluating bias and evaluating risk revolves around getting things like longitudinal studies and proper control groups and elimination of variables. And when you have so many things going on in one country at one time, it can be really hard to figure out what variable is causing a particular ailment, let's say a rise in the rates of cancer. So, with this in mind, when you look at the situation in Iraq, tracking people over long periods of time, many, many years, can be difficult because they could get killed, or they could move away, or they could become refugees, or you could just lose track of them because the place where you were keeping the records got destroyed. And so, the kinds of studies that you'd need to really have conclusive proof are not feasible in a place with constant ongoing warfare. Um, as a result, a lot of reports from the gray literature from organizations like the WHO and the IAEA got more traction than peer-reviewed studies, even though they've been heavily criticized too. Indeed, Shelby Surdick et al. Looked at a research piece done by the WHO and decided that not only was it biased, but that it wasn't even worth discussing, and even said that they'd done more harm than good by doing this piece of research. So this will obviously be clearer if you're reading the chapter, but those are the main points around risk communication. If you're trying to communicate the risk of something, how dangerous it actually is, having proper evidence can be difficult in these circumstances. Then people will wind up relying on well-known organizations doing research rather than research that's really gone through in-depth peer review. So along with risk communication, I also looked at framing strategies. What I found was that the same way activists will try to frame depleted uranium by comparing it to other weapons that have already been banned, scientists also compared depleted uranium to other toxic or radioactive substances, in particular natural uranium. And in particular, scientists that did not think depleted uranium was dangerous would focus on natural uranium and say, if natural uranium doesn't cause a certain ailment and it's more radioactive than depleted uranium, then there's no way depleted uranium could cause that ailment. However, more research has come out showing that depleted uranium actually works very differently in the body than natural uranium does. So, an article that only looks at natural uranium but tries to draw conclusions about depleted uranium perhaps shouldn't be taken at face value. Similarly, I noticed that different authors will frame their research in different ways, essentially trying to use their research to make arguments, sometimes even political or activist based arguments. Um, and that sometimes it even seems like the research would look similar to an outside person, but the authors would be making very different arguments. This came up a lot, and I use specific examples in the PhD thesis, but this came up a lot with variable elimination. One author would say, I can't eliminate all the variables, but it's clear that depleted uranium is a factor, which is a reason we should stop using it. And another author would say, I can't eliminate all the variables, therefore do not try to draw any political conclusions from this. And they would essentially be washing their hands of the politics of it and trying to stay out of it. Finally, Iraqi people and EOD technicians view depleted uranium as dangerous in a way that is not reflected in the scientific literature. So I interviewed an Iraqi refugee. I also interviewed EOD technicians, and I myself became an EOD technician during the course of this research. And one person I interviewed in particular had been an Iraq War veteran and had actually gone into Iraq looking for depleted uranium strike sites to try to clean them up. And the way that they found them was that they would talk to local Iraqi people in villages nearby, areas where battles had happened, and ask them, have you had anybody in your village get sick after going scrap picking? And sure enough, the villagers would say, yes, everybody that's gone to this particular site has gotten really sick or died. And that is how they found the depleted uranium strike sites, was just asking where scrap pickers got sick. So if that was how they found strike sites, and it was so incredibly effective at finding strike sites, it seems to me that, the way that Iraqi people and the way that military people experience depleted uranium as incredibly dangerous should be taken into account, even if the scientific literature hasn't quite caught up to that yet. This is what Bruce Leuvenstein calls the lay expertise model, where lay people and scientists should work together to try to find conclusions. So along with framing analysis, I also looked at narrative analysis, and this is what you wind up getting put into rather than how you frame your arguments. And most scientists are, of course, trying to avoid fitting into a narrative because they want to present their research as objectively as possible. A major exception to this are articles that attempt to summarize the debate. And these articles look at, the large swath of literature and try to point out major articles that have contributed to our understanding of the topic. What I found was that they just inevitably left out some key articles or failed to present the full nuance of others. Two really good examples are the IAEA claiming there is no evidence that either natural uranium or depleted uranium is carcinogenic, which can only be true if you ignore a number of studies, including work from Alexandra Miller and the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute, which is linked directly to the U.S. military. She has written a number of articles over the course of the past 20 years, clearly demonstrating a connection between depleted uranium exposure and tumor growth. So you can't make that argument if you read her research, and they've just conveniently left her research out of their summary. I also found Armando Fa et al., this is a 2017 paper, made a claim that breast cancer for girls under the age of 15 is on the rise, And that appears to just be a mistranslation. So they had another one of these articles that was a broad review of the literature. And it's a very good review, but on this point, they really messed up. And it's really important to get your facts right when the consequences are this massive. Because if you get your facts wrong, even if you make a lot of good points, you can wind up having your research dismissed entirely. And in a case like toxicity and a case like radioactivity, people's lives could be at stake, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. My major conclusion in this chapter was simply that science can never be fully separated from the society that it's in. Politics has a big influence on society, and of course, science eventually has a big influence on politics, but even that can not necessarily go in the direction you'd expect. We can see that with debates like vaccines and climate change, and depleted uranium is no exception to that. Uh, and you're trying to do this research, you want to be as objective as possible, but of course, whether or not you get funding for the research can be politically motivated, what journals you get published in can be politically motivated, and definitely how much reach and influence your research has can be politically motivated. And so it's important just to understand the context in which you're publishing research and doing research. There will always be a society that benefits or doesn't benefit from your research. And you have to have that in the back of your mind when you're approaching this topic. Understand that this topic in particular has a lot of political baggage around it. And just navigating that can be incredibly helpful to making sure that your research is at the highest quality and helps the most people. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. My name is Matt Fuller, and it's been a pleasure working with Talks Learn for EU.